Welcome to Sustainable Tourism Development Module 3. In this particular section, we're going to talk all about understanding the community. Sustainable tourism is tourism that minimizes the costs and maximizes the benefits of tourism for natural environments and local communities. And it can be carried out indefinitely without harming the resources on which it depends. What you will notice in your reading for this particular section is it really focuses primarily on MPAs, or marine protected areas. Although this can apply to all areas, this is a particular one where you will see that policy stakeholders and processes have really been defined and provide you with great examples and case studies. Let's start out with differentiating sustainable tourism from conventional tourism. Conventional tourism is not necessarily planned to enhance, conserve, or educate, and does not benefit the local community and can rapidly damage a fragile environment. As a result, it can destroy or unrecognizably alter the very resources and cultures on which it depends. In contrast, sustainable tourism is deliberately planned from the beginning to benefit local residents, respect local culture, conserve natural resources, and educate both tourists and local residents. Sustainable tourism can produce the same profits as conventional tourism, but more of the profits stay with the local community, and the region's natural resources and culture can be protected. In many cases, conventional tourism practices of the past have posed a major threat to marine conservation due to lack of management controls and effective planning mechanisms. In contrast, sustainable tourism deliberately seeks to minimize the negative impacts of tourism while contributing to conservation and the well-being of the community, both economically and socially. Conventional tourism does not often provide sources of funding for both conservation programs and local communities, while providing incentives for protective areas from practices and development that are harmful to the natural beauty of an area. Opportunities and threats can only be controlled through well-planned and managed sustainable tourism. Effective planning of sustainable tourism seeks to maximize the local benefits of tourism and minimize the local costs, while still remaining economically feasible. Any such planning must include all relevant stakeholders. Most importantly, it must include the local community, and it must include experienced tourism operators. In addition, it should include as many other stakeholders as possible. So who are the stakeholders, and how does sustainable tourism affect them? Well, let's first start with defining what is a stakeholder. Stakeholders are any people or groups who have an interest or a stake in decisions being made by a management agency. Particularly in marine protected area decision-making, stakeholders can include any individuals or groups interested in or affected, and it's affected both positively or negatively, by any type of coastal and marine resources and their uses. For example, in coastal communities, stakeholders may include local residents and fisher people, as well as members of several other groups, including a marine protected area management group, members of the local municipality, the tourism industry, meaning tour operators, hotels, restaurants, and more, the fishing industry, both local and non-local, local biodiversity conservation organizations, community development organizations, indigenous people organizations, coastal farming communities, transport authorities, and even the scientific community. Stakeholders can only be involved once they know and once you know who they are. They must be identified and then approached and queried as to what their interests and opinions are. As an initial setup, often tourism planning teams can brainstorm with local contacts about who to specifically invite or consult with and how to engage with those individuals or groups. Once the key stakeholders have been identified, the team should determine the best means of engaging with the different stakeholders based on their level of input and potential involvement in the future tourism development. For example, it may be necessary to hold individual consultations or workshops with local businesses and conservation groups, while explaining the overall process to the general public might be more effective. What you will see here in this diagram is a very simple three-step process. identifying the stakeholders and the nature of their interests, consultation, and involvement. Ideally, representatives of major stakeholder groups should eventually be involved with any tourism development management project, as well as any managers that are going to help develop for more of a sustainable tourism approach. This working group will often consist of the same team that was assembled if an assessment process was completed as part of feasibility in tourism development. The process of identifying stakeholders also helps to identify which individuals and groups will be affected and how. That includes those of the tourism destination that's being developed, as well as those in the local community. It is a process of trying to discover who is likely to gain from tourism development and who is likely to lose, and by how much. Understanding the different groups in the particular tourism area can help to make sure that sustainable tourism planning is appropriate. It's important to also note that all stakeholders will not have the same stake or the level of interest in whatever the development project may be. Understanding that stakeholders can also help to protect changes in social behavior, local culture, traditions, and quality of life issues that might result from tourism development, and therefore is another encouragement to engage all of the appropriate stakeholders. A critical aspect of sustainable tourism planning, therefore, is to identify and understand the major stakeholders and to understand their point of view, goals, and motivations. Often, it's most important to start with the local community. For local residents, tourism not only has an economic impact, but also touches their personal lives. Tourism affects their lifestyles, traditions, and cultures, as well as their livelihood. Unlike other players in the tourism industry, local communities must deal with tourism whether or not they choose to. Some rural communities that were once quiet and peaceful are finding themselves invaded by international tourists, most of whom are just passing through and not staying to meet local residents. Residents have mixed reactions to this intrusion. Some want nothing to do with the tourists, while others are intrigued by the employment opportunities. Whatever their initial reaction, local residents are often underprepared for the demands of tourism. They often cannot compete with the powerful tourism industry and do not understand the desires and behaviors of the fierce independent travelers who want to discover the new areas. Community members play an essential role in tourism. They may play many direct roles, and it's important to make sure that they're constantly informed. Some of the direct roles that the community members may have is renting land for development, working as occasional part-time or even full-time staff for private tour operators, providing services to private operators such as food guides, transportation, and lodging, forming joint ventures with private tour operators who usually provide marketing, logistics, bilingual guides, while the community will provide most of the services, and operating independent community-based tourism programs. In addition, even if they are not directly involved in the tourist industry, they play an indirect role that affects the success of any sustainable tourism enterprise. Local residents informally interact with tourists, and that plays a large role in making the tourist experience a positive or negative one. For example, is the tourist feeling welcome? Do they feel safe? Are they comfortable? Landowners also play a critical role in the ecological health of the area, especially in buffer zones of core protected areas near beaches, around river mouths, and any other marine protected area. And of course, coastal communities themselves will be often highly affected by tourism. Their homes, towns, families, and lives will be changed if tourism becomes a major part of the area. To make the tourist-resident interaction a mutually beneficial one, and to make sustainable tourism a success, it is of paramount importance to understand the benefits and threats of tourism for local communities. And the only way to do that is to engage with them as part of the planning process. One of sustainable tourism's greatest contributions is the degree in which it can shift tourism's impact on a local community from threats to benefits. Local residents play an important role in sustainable tourism for two main reasons. First, it is their homeland and workplaces that are attracting natural travelers. Second, the support of the local residents are essential for the success of any conservation effort, including sustainable tourism. In addition, local or traditional knowledge is often a key component of the visitor's experience and education. The negative environmental, cultural, and social impacts of unsustainable tourism development have affected local people in many areas prior to the development of sustainable tourism practices. Traditional communities and indigenous people can play a major role in conserving biodiversity, but this has been acknowledged only recently. And important issues relating to participation, land and resource use, and even democracy still need to be addressed in the context of tourism development. Local authorities have an essential role as moderators and facilitators of empowerment for local communities. Experience with top-down approaches to protected area management has demonstrated that, if they are excluded, local people can undermine biodiversity conservation efforts. Likewise, approaches to tourism development that do not take local people's priorities into account can be undermined by civil unrest, hostility towards tourists, and decreased safety for tourists. The local community is not an undifferentiated mass, but comprises itself of people of different economic classes, family groups, ethnic groups, genders, and various special interest groups. Every community is different and includes many that are indirectly or directly involved with the resources that support sustainable tourism development. Efforts to involve the community should recognize and respect these different groups and the diversity of these groupings within the community. Securing the support of local communities requires more than just simply raising awareness of issues. In fact, it really has to be that we have to work with these local communities in order for them to demonstrate a very profound awareness of the issues and to have some good ideas for the resolutions of the problems, often to the surprise of management officers and consulting advisors on these sustainable tourism projects. But the communities will also need confidence that the management authority and protected area and those involved in the process are going to help them, not just to place restrictions to them or to extract more licensing fee, taxes, or bribes. They also need confidence that the risks involved with change are manageable and worthwhile in the time context of their own needs. Communities need to know that their efforts will be rewarded by their support from those developing tourism provisions and by the provision of exclusive rights to resources under their management and by formal recognition of their role in resource management and harvest. Communities may benefit from organizing a village-based system to plan and manage their coastal activities as one example in a sustainable way. They also may benefit from informing on effective means to control outside groups that exploitate resources unsustainably. For example, it might be even an outside dive operator or an outside fisherman. Communities also will benefit from assistance on switching to alternative resources or practices. Communities should participate in all stages of planning, including the resource assessments, identifying problems, and defining actions to resolve them. It is important to verify their perceptions of resources with independent observations, since occasionally opinions may be based on inaccurate impressions. Communities should be also involved in a final review and approval of any protected area management plan, including location zones, boundaries, and controls. The protected area should be integrated into the existing village institutional structure whenever possible, with clear definitions of community and management roles and responsibilities and avoidance of parallel structures whenever possible. Generally, involvement of the community often follows 4 steps that you're going to see here below. Identifying the stakeholders and forming the appropriate partnerships, community organization and making sure the appropriate groups are engaged, involving the community in the full planning process from the start to the end, and then the ongoing flow of information, education, and communication. It's so important that stakeholders are accessible and have more opportunities to be involved if they are organized and if they have the support of those that they're working with. There are some key considerations for sustainable tourism development in communities. These include creating partnerships. Sustainable tourism organized by local communities requires assistance and cooperation from tourism operators, who usually will have much better links to the market, better understanding of tourist needs, and better language skills and communication abilities. It's also important not to, for the lack of a better phrase, avoid putting all eggs in one tourism basket. Relying solely on tourism is unwise because tourism demand fluctuates unpredictably and because tourism alone cannot provide enough jobs to sustain an entire community. Sustainable tourism must be seen as one of several strategies in a community's development. Other important elements are education, access to information, protected area management, and increasing economic opportunities in other non-tourism fields. Lastly, it's important to link sustainable tourism benefits to conservation goals for the community. For sustainable tourism to promote conservation, local people must clearly benefit from sustainable tourism and must understand the link between the benefits they are receiving and the existence of the protected areas or developed areas. Although tourism may be driven by the private sector in many cases, government policy instruments such as requirements for environmental impact assessments, or referred to as EIAs, and management plans can be extraordinarily effective in ensuring that development takes place in the appropriate manner. In many biodiversity hotspot countries, tourism destinations are under the influence of various governmental agencies whose mandates include culture, historical heritage, parks, coastal protection, economic development, fishery management, and forestry. Smooth coordination among these departments and coherence between tourism policy and other government policies, including biodiversity conservation, are not always the rule, and therefore different policies may undermine rather than support one another. National governments usually set the framework for tourism development and biodiversity conservation through policy and legislation. Some examples of these include the following: laws and regulations defining standards for tourism facilities, access to biodiversity resources, and land use regulation and zoning. This may include requirements for environmental impact statements before development. Infrastructure design, development, and regulation, for example, related to water, energy, roads, and airports. Economic instruments defined in policy, such as incentives for sustainable tourism investment and the creation of private reserves. Standards for health and safety, including quality controls and regulation of business activities. These are aimed at protecting consumers and at meeting the needs of the residents, including traditional communities and indigenous people, and protecting their lifestyles. The establishment and maintenance of protected areas and conservation corridors of those interested in tourism. Managers of publicly protected areas are often the most effective players for conservation benefits from tourism development, and should also be critically involved. And then lastly, allocation of tax revenues for the protection of biodiverse-based tourism attractions, such as national parks, reserves, and any sustainable tourism development area. At the destination level, local authorities are often responsible for implementing policies regarding tourism and biodiversity conservation. Local authorities are well placed to negotiate between the various interests of local and outside entrepreneurs, civil society, and national government agencies, and they hold essential regulatory and zoning mandates that allow for the enforcement of guidelines and standards. On the other hand, the capacity of local authorities to manage this complex and fragmented industry effectively and to ensure its positive contribution to local strategies for sustainable development, it is dependent on whether or not local policy making is coherent with national policy instruments and agencies. In many transnational and developing countries, governments may also play a different role of tour operators and hotel managers, either to try to jumpstart quality standards or to generate revenue. Many conservation-oriented NGOs or non-governmental organizations, these could include Conservation International, Rainforest Alignment as two examples, embrace sustainable tourism because it's direct link to conservation. So conservation NGOs frequently are going to act and have many different roles, such as facilitators between other players, for example, between the communities in the tourism industry, partners with sustainable tourism companies, whether locally owned or not, trainers and sources of technical information and expertise, partners with protected area administrators, often helping obtain funding or carrying out some type of activity related to environmental education or even an interpretation program, managers of their own private protected areas or sometimes of government administered protective areas, but rarely NGOs may directly provide tourism services such as promotion, lodging, transport, and food. However, this can distract an NGO from its primary mission and can remove opportunities for community-based enterprises or the private sector.